Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's great to see some familiar faces in the audience, the virtual audience. Thank you for joining us today for this CGIS brief. It is our last brief for this semester, but fear not, we will be returning in the fall semester with a whole brand new line of other fun topics to talk about in relation to international education, study abroad, all that jazz. So let's go ahead and get started. Just I'm going to mention this in a little bit, but, I just want to reference that we are not experts in this, colonization, but we are very excited to talk to you about this topic today. But before we get started, let me just do a quick intro. My name is Steven Gonzalez. I am the communication specialist here at CGIS, and I will let my co-hosts introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ashton Troxel, and I'm an intercultural programs advisor at CGIS, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
And I am Callie Rouse. I am also an intercultural programs advisor, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
All right. So this is a 25-30-minute conversation that we're having today. And, as a disclaimer, this is a topic that we talk about a lot at CGIS. We talk a lot about colonialism because we are in the business of sending students abroad. And so it's important to make sure that our programs line up with our office's mission. We're always trying to be cognizant of where we're sending our students and that we're very clear with them on their purpose when traveling, especially to non-traditional locations. We have to continue to do that research and put in the time that we can so that we can understand how we might be contributing to colonialism. I also really want to encourage everybody, whether you're a student, a staff, or faculty, to be proactive when it comes to travel. I'm not just talking about proactive packing or researching the sites you want to see, which is definitely something that we always talk about in these briefs. But I just want you to take that opportunity to learn a little bit about that country's history, both negative and positive, because there is so much to learn out there. And like I said before, we are not professionals in colonization, but this is just a topic that we oftentimes comes up in conversation, and we just want to contribute in some way. And so if you have any questions, if you have any concerns or input that you would like to make, please feel free to add that to the chat, or you can even unmute yourself and ask a question or make a note. Let's really focus on calling each other in rather than calling each other out, because there's just so much to learn about it. So with that, let's get started. So why does it all matter? As conscious travelers, we need to think about our actions abroad constantly, as we want to make sure we're asking ourselves, are we perpetuating centuries of colonialism? What are some ways that, we can combat any racist actions? How can we be better allies for not just our peers, but for other people in other countries? How can we advocate for them? In terms of perpetuating colonialism, I'm reminded of something as simple as choosing to stay in a resort versus staying in a local hotel. These huge resorts that continue to grow and thrive off of travelers looking for leisure and relaxation, though they continue to expand, and in its own way is often like colonialism, modern day colonialism. They're taking away businesses from locals. Locals really have no choice but to sell their land, and the rich continue to get rich off of countries that they don't even live in themselves. These resorts are essentially creating a monopoly for jobs. Locals have no choice but to go to work for them because there is nothing else in the area where they can earn a living wage. And really what came to mind was the Four Seasons. The Four Seasons is all over the world. And I was reading that as of 2007, Bill Gates through Cascade Investments, and Prince Al Walid bin Talal through Kingdom Holding Company are the majority owners of the Four Seasons, and they are collectively earning $4.3 billion annually, and they have plans to continue to expand that empire. So like I was saying, that's just one of many examples of modern day colonialism. And there's so much that we can do to combat that. Like we always talk in other previous briefs, choose local tour guides, local businesses and hotels that you're gonna have a positive impact on that community. Moving on to intercultural competency, it really is key. We say this in a lot of our presentations and in a lot of our pre-departures. You really should act as an observer. You're not there to change the world or its people. That's not our responsibility. And that's certainly not something that CGIS or anyone really in international education here at the University of Michigan pushes students to do. We are citizens of the world, and it's important to remember that you are traveling to learn about culture, to see how people operate in a society completely different from your own. Your American values on race, gender, religion, etc., does not translate abroad, and you should not expect it to. But there can be a nice balance between your values and your host countries. There's room for that cultural exchange where both parties can learn something from each other. We have been going back and forth about what is a really good quote to add, and this quote on the right-hand side comes from a student, Alexis Smith, who traveled abroad with us 3 times, and she was also a student worker. She is the golden child of CGIS. And, she wrote a very long paragraph, but this is just an excerpt out of like her story that she had to tell about visiting South Africa in one of our GIU programs. She wrote, "I was spending 4 weeks in South Africa working with the Zulu people who have traditions different from my own and challenged my feminist identity and the right I had to place judgment as a visitor. My responsibility was to approach the situation with respect and an understanding that I am there as a visitor. It is not my role to place my external values and beliefs upon their cultural and customs. To maintain respect, it was important that I followed their traditions, even if they were new to me." This is a great reminder how you can have your values. You can certainly take them with you, but never make it your mission to change people's minds. And we've got some really good examples coming up that Kelly and Ashton are going to talk a little bit more in depth. But for now, that concludes everything I have to say, and I will pass it on to Kelly.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. So I am going to very briefly touch on kind of some history here around colonialism and earlier study abroad. So first off, what is colonialism? So colonialism is essentially the practice of extending and maintaining a nation's political and economic control over another people or area. So colonialism was often characterized by imposing foreign values and beliefs on local populations, and in part also elites from colonial powers would tour colonized countries as an exciting and exotic location to visit. This picture here of Kate from the royal family kind of draws connections there to back when royals would come to royals from the British Empire as well as other empires would come to their colonized nations and explore and see exciting things in those countries. And it's also important to think when we're thinking about colonialism, it's a very, very recent history of colonialism that, many of the former colonial nations only very recently gained independence, and that we are still seeing a modern day form of colonialism still taking place with Great Britain, France, the United States, and others, such as the protectorate status that the United States holds over places like Guam and Puerto Rico. And Another element is also the, and getting into more of the modern conversation about travel, there was also a lot of like ideas of tours and things like that, not only to colonized countries, but also to other countries around Europe, which kind of transforms into the modern day study abroad. So modern international travel as study abroad came into existence mostly in the 20th century, where things switched from, kind of like touring countries and things like that to more of a focus on, foreign language study in other countries, particularly in Western Europe, as considered like beacons of education. So the beginning of international education as a field really began in Western Europe. Here at UM, it was like in the 50s or 60s that the first like study abroad experiences happened, where they went to like France and learned French in the country. And there was, again, that kind of evolution from like early touring to, again, that kind of idea of like touring around while studying, while on breaks between study in foreign countries to see what all you could see. And then travel to the global south became something that was in the form of mission work or volunteerism, where people were going into countries that had been massively impacted by colonialism, and continuing the efforts of converting people to Christianity, or going in and kind of trying to like build up certain areas that honestly sometimes had been built or broken down by their own ancestors.
Something, Callie, we didn't mention when we were going through this is when study abroad started, it was often wealthy white women, which we put in here, but still to this day, it's, still white women going abroad most prevalently. So how can we break down barriers to get more students from different backgrounds abroad?
Yeah, and that is, predominantly a lot of the people who engage in these study abroad experiences are very wealthy, white, highly educated. They used to tend towards men who would go on these kind of travels, but it has definitely switched towards wealthy white women. And we definitely see that still kind of as a trend nowadays. With the question about what was France actually the first organized study abroad destination, I don't remember if it was France. It was like France or Italy was one of them. I remember it was focused on language study in Western Europe, but I'm not sure if France was exactly the right location. I would have to look at the history again.
I know when I was doing work, when I first started my position, we were going through the bicentennial, and I was looking at the history of study abroad at the University of Michigan. And I do know that it was Germany, Switzerland, and the UK, which were like the only three options at the time, like I think as early as like 1918. And like the first woman to go abroad at the University of Michigan was in like the 40s. And she went to France, specifically to France. And I want to say it was Aix-en-Provence, but I
think so. I think Aix was the first like organized travel as like a group of people going to do language study.
France, right.
Yeah. So kind of touching on a little bit of like colonial history as well as like earlier study abroad history. So when we pull them both together, what are the differences and the similarities? So on the next slide. Awesome. We kind of look at the differences and also the similarities between the two. So first off is on the one side, colonialists. So what was distinct about colonialists was predominantly the travel was to developing or colonial colonized nations. There was an imposition of social structures, religion, and more on the local communities. And there was an emphasis on seeking wealth and extracting physical resources from the population, whether that be the actual population of that country, as well as goods. It was very heavily characterized by genocide, and that leisure travel was limited to the wealthiest members of society. When it comes to modern study abroad travelers, what's distinct about them is that oftentimes we're seeing study abroad students are predominantly going to Western Europe for short durations, though tourists will often visit these tropical destinations that are more likely to be developing nations. And there's also a view of the world through a digital landscape that's very different from how it was before we had social media. And also an emphasis on experience. So not necessarily materially bringing something back, but having a certain kind of experience, going to certain types of locations that you can talk about and post about later. And access has also expanded beyond the wealthiest to other members of society. So when does the two overlap? So we were thinking through what are the elements that we think are most likely to see in both colonialists and modern travelers. So first off is the emphasis on observing host communities, but not really integrating in them. The idea that your own values and beliefs are superior to those of locals. So, like thinking that like Western feminism ideals are superior to other countries' way of living and things like that. The idea of touring around as a rite of passage of like, collecting countries that you've gone to that you can share out with people. Locals viewed as others and different from yourself. A Superman or white savior complex, especially when going to countries that are former colonial states, and going in and helping them out and, improving those countries, that idea of like, we're going to come in and save them. The experiences have always heavily centered the traveler's experience, the traveler's enjoyment of this experience, as well as visiting highlights, popular destinations with less focus on, unsavory past connected with, how certain countries have had such wealth or how such countries have been deprived of such wealth, and having that deeper conversation is often not had. And as well, the imposition of language, the idea that they will or must speak your language and you don't have to speak in theirs.
Thanks, Callie. That was really helpful. I think, the first step to becoming a more conscious traveler, or if you're planning study abroad experiences for students, is just awareness. So some things like you can think about before you go, like when you're choosing a program or trying to figure out where to go on vacation, is, the length of time you're going to be abroad is going to be really important. If you're only going abroad for 3 weeks, you're probably going to have to work a lot harder to make connections with the host community and integrate yourself. So think about that. Maybe going abroad for a full semester is better. Also, the location of where you go is really important. You may not really understand what it's like to live as an average French person if you're going only to Paris. You may want to go to some smaller towns. That's why we love to choose small cities for our language program, like Nantes or Alicante in Spain. So students are getting out of these more English-speaking bubbles when they're trying to learn a language. So that segues really well into, do you need to know the local language, or are you willing to learn? So even on some of our short-term programs that CJIS offers, like the GCC programs, students typically don't have to know the local language because they're only abroad for 3 weeks. But during our pre-departure orientation, we offer a language workshop. So students can start, learning basic phrases, and they can get around and try to make those connections in the short time that they have while they're abroad. Another thing to consider is who will be on your program with you. We have a lot of different program models where you could be enrolling with local students or other international students, or you may be on a program with only American students. So then these other questions of how you're going to engage with the host community and locals becomes even more important. And one of those aspects is living with the host family. So think about where you're living, even if you are studying abroad for a whole semester. If you're living with other Americans in an apartment, how are you going to meet local Italian students or local Japanese students if you're living in your comfort zone? So really challenging yourself here. So when planning, think about the activities on the program itinerary. Are the academic excursions really focused on museums? Does it sound more like a tour that you could just, pay and have a tour guide take you to all these places? Like if you didn't visit the Colosseum, you didn't go to Rome, like what else are you doing in that city? Some good examples are, even if you're with a group of US students, maybe you're studying health policy. Are you going to meet with a local NGO that's an advocate for maternal health in that country? Can you compare maternal health in the US to maternal health in India and learn from each other? So think about that as you're preparing for your travel and how you may learn from cultural misunderstandings. I think that's going to just take some self-awareness, and you'll want to reflect on these frustrations that you may face abroad and learn and grow from them, just like Alexis did from that quote in the Why It Matters section. And Callie or Stephen, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about while you're abroad. We've prepared a lot of briefs that actually connect really well to this presentation and learning to be a more conscious traveler. I think Stephen mentioned earlier, understanding the historical and social context of the places you're going is really important. Whatever's there in the present, it could be very beautiful. It's probably a tourist destination. There's probably lots of shops and people, but what was there 100 years ago? What was life like, and how has that impacted local communities, especially local minority communities? We kind of go into more detail on this on the documenting experiences abroad ethically. Another thing to consider while you're abroad is an equal exchange of learning. Are you learning from your professor, or are you going to engage in more spiritual learning, maybe something that you're not used to here in the American style classroom? Another thing is where to visit. We've talked about this a lot in our briefs of getting outside, of typical tourist destinations. So I know, Callie, you have a really great example of a non-Western focused museum that you went to when you were abroad.
Yeah, so I studied abroad for a semester in the Czech Republic, and I, of course, went to Czech museums while I was there. But also when I was visiting the town of Brno, my friends and I discovered that there was a Roma museum there. So the Roma population is a minority population in the Czech Republic, but it's also an extremely discriminated and really disparaged population there. And going to the Roma Museum and spending our afternoon there was one of the most enlightening parts of my experience. And seeing the history that they themselves had collected and the stories they were telling about their own people was a really good contrast to the narrative I'd been getting from the local Czech population. So, and I think we have some programs that kind of have touched on these kind of topics before. We've had our Black Paris course and our Contemporary London course, which again are focusing on non-white people living in countries that you generally think of only as, white people, British people, countries, when there's a lot more nuance and complexity, and especially when you bring colonialism in, all the countries that are connected to these via colonialism.
Yeah, thanks, Callie. So investing in the local economy, we talk about that a lot, and sustainable travel and our impact, which is really important. I know a lot of people like to try McDonald's in all the different countries that they travel to just to see what it's like. But supporting locals and local minorities is a really great step into just being a more conscious traveler. Engaging in the local language, we've talked about this a lot. That, saying hello, asking a simple question is going to get you a lot of respect from the locals and show that you're trying to make an effort. And finally, being an ally abroad is really important, not only for the local community, but also your group members. Often when you're traveling with other American students, you're probably making friends with someone you have similar background to. So challenge yourself to make friends with someone you may not normally meet in your social circles here at U of M, because they're going to have really great perspectives to share.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Ashton and Callie. I have to say, as someone who has, we've done these different briefs all the time. It's always interesting because there's always so much we want to add to these slides, but we know we only have a certain amount of time. And we know that there's already so many other people who are doing some pretty incredible work. So I hope you all are at least encouraged to read a little bit more on it and hopefully learn more what we could not provide. Hopefully this is just like a starting point. I think some of reading through some of these articles here, one thing that stuck out was that, for colonizers, the biggest, or for colonizers, it was a rite of passage to visit these countries that they were visiting. And I think now travel is almost like a rite of passage for a lot of people, especially when you think of yourself, when you're a minority. For us, it's like we want to do everything that, society says that we can't do. And I think that, and I think that's something great to strive for. And it's always interesting because you want to make sure that you're being better than those that have come before you, and that you're thinking differently and you're engaging differently with people, and that we're constantly treating people with as much respect as possible, because people, BIPOCs especially, know what those kinds of struggles are, the repercussions of colonization. So I think there's just so much that we could talk about, and I wish we could spend more time. Hopefully, maybe one day we can do a part 2 to this. But we've listed some resources. There's so much more out there, so I encourage you all to search more. Obviously, you all will get these slides in an email so that you can do a read through of them.
I would also note, I would also note that, in trying to become less of a colonial traveler and having less of an overlap with literal colonists, you may still make mistakes and things like that. And it can be really beneficial to share that and be like, oh, what was this experience like? I was thinking, in relation to this was, when I was in Lithuania to do research as a student, I went to this it was intended to be like this off the beaten path kind of tour, that it was kind of weird, not, non-traditional locations to visit to in Vilnius, the capital there. And I was like, oh, this is going to be so cool. It's not like the boring tourist thing. And then I found out that part of it was really cool, and it showed me local areas and things that you wouldn't normally see on a tourist thing. But it also involved slum tourism, where we literally went to an area where people were living in shacks and things like that. And it was and they were presenting it as look at these crazy people living in their little shacks. And I was and it was okay, I was seeing something that normally I wouldn't see, but it was the way it was presented. I was so uncomfortable with it, and I didn't realize that I was going to engage in that, which some tourism is a whole other thing to get into. But even in trying to be I'm gonna do this the right way, I still kind of ended up engaging in not so great kind of tourist activities.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think like, we also have to acknowledge that we live in a system that was built from the colonization. So yeah, we're gonna make mistakes. We're not all perfect. And like I know sometimes when I'm talking to my friends about going abroad, I'm just like, yeah, but don't you want to like do something local? And they're just like, no. And it's like, okay, maybe I'm biased because I'm in international ed, but like, like I want to engage with them more. And so like, I have to take myself out of it too and say like, yeah, we're to your point, we are going to make mistakes. There is sometimes no escaping certain things, especially, yeah, especially when you're younger and you're eager to get out and you're eager to see the world. Like that makes sense.
I really like the point that Ren added of they said something I like to do before going to a new country is to pick up a novel by a local author to have an access point to help people understand themselves through art, especially novels written by folks from colonized countries, writing about that experience. Things that fall apart in Animals, People, and Frankenstein in Baghdad come to mind. Very cool.
Yeah, and Vesta wrote, being from Turkey, she can really relate to the land grabbing and turning of public places and beaches into private resorts owned by foreign investments. Yeah, this is a huge problem happening all over the world. Does anyone else have any other comments, questions? I mean, we can try our best to talk through anything, any thoughts that people might have regarding this topic. Very intense, very, very broad topic.
Our resource list will be included in the presentation that we share out. So maybe we could also include that plain text in when we share out this presentation and its recording. It will go out to everybody who registered for the event.
Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions, we will stay on. But for those of you who do have no comments or questions, thank you for coming. And we hope you have a great weekend and a great summer. And we will see you next term for the CGIS brief. Bye, everybody.